Hey, this is just a quick note about our sponsor, Privado, the premier enterprise privacy platform, purpose-built to bridge the gap between privacy and engineering. Its privacy code scanning solution embeds privacy, compliance, and governance into the product development lifecycle and empowers privacy and security teams with unparalleled visibility of sensitive data flows and the insights to find and fix privacy vulnerabilities. You can leverage Privado's data flows, dynamic data mapping, privacy assessment automation, and real-time visibility of privacy issues. Enter the era of proactive privacy and transform privacy from business blocker to business enabler. To learn more, go to privado.ai.
Any candidate that goes into interview for any job should have, in my opinion, a really clear why they want that job and why they would be good at it. If you can answer that question or give a hiring manager, interviewer, whoever it is, like a really clear and confident answer, to me, that's always going to have them leaving the interview with a really good feeling. Even if it's not the right fit, they're still going to leave with a really positive impression of you. And for me, really specifically, if you're looking to make a jump into a slightly different industry, having a really clear why that you can articulate appropriately and share with that person, it's always going to put you in a really great spot.
Welcome, everyone, to Shifting Privacy Left. I'm your host and resident privacy guru, Deborah J. Farber. Today, I'm delighted to welcome my next guest, George Ratcliffe, head of the Privacy, GRC, and Cryptography Executive Search Practice at recruitment firm Stott and May. So as you might imagine, we're going to talk about, the field for privacy technologists, and I'm really excited to dig deep. Welcome, George.
Thanks, Deborah. Great to be on and really looking forward to what should be a great and hopefully a really useful conversation for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot of appetite from my audience to really better understand trends in the job market. So I'm so excited you're here. I know you have so much firsthand knowledge about the job market for privacy roles in particular. So this discussion is going to be pretty enlightening for those who are seeking new positions with titles like privacy engineer, privacy architect, privacy researcher, and even GRC engineer, in addition to non-technical privacy roles. So I can't wait to dive deeper on some of the trends you're seeing. Let's start with some of the technical privacy roles in the context of the current market climate. So about 4 months ago, in a previous Shifting Privacy Left podcast episode, I had Minoti Minatello, a privacy engineering manager who had just left Twitter at the time and is now at, I believe, Netflix. We talked about his observation that privacy engineers were being laid off at a much higher rate than companies were hiring for them. And his concern about that will affect, how will that affect the hiring pipeline for the profession? And so I guess my first question to you is, are you seeing the hiring trends pick back up for technical privacy roles?
Yeah, so I actually love this episode. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that I took from Minoti that's been, to be honest, really helpful for my understanding of the space. So firstly, I completely agreed with Minoti's observations. It's really concerning to kind of see it happening. And I think, we've all seen plenty of tech layoffs before, but it's the first time I've really seen people being laid off in privacy in coming onto a decade that I've recruited in the space, or certainly en masse. So yeah, it was definitely really kind of concerning at the time. I think the one thing I would have added to that is that the gap we saw between the number of jobs available, the number of people being hired and the people being laid off, I'd have said was pretty uniform, across tech. So it wasn't like we were much of an outlier compared to everybody else. We just hadn't really seen it before. But yeah, in short, we're seeing a massive rebound here at the moment. A lot of tech companies more kind of in that sort of pre and post IPO stage of development, as opposed to the really big tech companies just yet, are coming back to the table with technical hiring across all of the skill sets that you kind of mentioned. Now, we're not back to that kind of volume and that bumper kind of year we saw at the back end of 21 and early 22. But for me at the moment, obviously a huge part of my job is keeping an eye on what's going on. And it definitely feels like each week we're seeing a little bit more. There's a couple of new positions coming out. There's a few new companies coming back to the table. And I think what's probably most encouraging for me is we're also starting to see companies that I haven't traditionally associated with having a privacy tech function coming out and looking to hire. They're fairly kind of broad and not entry level, but fairly broad and the first one or two hires they're making, but coming to the table with positions like that, which for me is really, really encouraging to see that world of privacy tech growing, not just in terms of people in certain organizations, but growing in terms of the number of organizations who are operating within the field.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that gives me a lot of enthusiasm as well. I just obviously love the privacy tech market. I'm a huge advocate for that. So I do agree. I'm seeing that too. I'm seeing a lot, not so much in the hiring, but a lot more privacy tech companies. So it's good to hear that they're expanding. And as they're expanding, they're looking for technologists that have privacy expertise. So everyone seems to have their own slightly different definition of a privacy engineer. And I thought you'd be the perfect person to ask based on what you're seeing across different organizations. What skill sets and competencies are companies seeking when they come to you saying they're looking to hire for a privacy engineering role?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to revisit another point Minotti made here. So we're still at such an early stage, I think, when it comes to privacy technology and specifically on the engineering side. And I've even heard certain people make I'd say fairly kind of like rudimentary comparison, but one that rings fairly true is that privacy tech is kind of where security engineering was maybe 8 or even kind of 10 years ago. In a sense, we've got all these different skill sets and so many different roles that are actually grouped under this same job title of privacy engineer. So rather than go through like everything that somebody could do within a privacy engineering or privacy tech role, I do like to kind of break it down into, for me, there's kind of like 3 key roles here that are different in their own way, but do sit under that same banner with the majority of companies out there. I'll run through some of the kind of like really key competencies that I see sit in each one most regularly. The most, I guess the first one is the privacy engineer, the job title that everybody kind of sticks on it, but this one is the one I guess we most commonly see in kind of big tech, right? It's the most common role we see at Google, at Meta, and a lot of the other kind of FANG businesses. Also, a lot of kind of like larger organizations who are still at an early-ish stage in kind of having privacy tech functionality as a whole. People who sit within this job typically do have a pretty strong technical or engineering background, but their focus is predominantly, for me, on reviewing codes, reviewing products that's brought to them by development and production teams. So looking to see if it sits within the organization's privacy policies, looking to see if it matches up with the privacy by design or privacy first kind of parameters they've had set out for them. Another kind of like key thing that goes in there is they're often working in quite a large sort of advisory capacity as well. So they'll plug in and work really closely with engineering and design teams to work through any problems, any gaps they've found to make sure that everything's redesigned appropriately before it then gets kind of like signed off, if you like, put into production and out in front of customers or consumers, depending on which side you're on. The next one is, I like to term it privacy software engineer. And I've been, if I'm honest, really happy to see this job title getting out there a little bit more regularly. Probably not something we'd have seen 18 months ago too often at all, but it's certainly becoming more common now. So privacy software engineer often performs some of that design review and advisory work that a privacy engineer would, but they also spend, a differentiating factor for me, is spending a lot of their time focusing on physically designing and building their own privacy preserving code or products. So obviously, without diving too deep, can be anything from looking at writing an anonymization code or script or something on the deletion side, right the way through to getting in some of the really kind of technical and advanced pieces like differential privacy programs and so on and so forth. The third kind of one, and I apologize to anybody that feels like they're being put into a bucket here. I'm just trying to keep this as broad and general for everybody. This is more on the research side. So privacy research engineer, again, something we're starting to see become more common, particularly within kind of advanced consumer tech companies and also within AI companies or pure privacy tech vendors as well. Like I said, more recent addition. So people in these roles typically sit at that intersection of academic research and production. So researching new applications that can be in some senses completely brand new for one of the privacy enhancing technologies that's specific to the needs of their employer or the specific product, before then going and obviously applying that research. And in fairness, I think Amazon have had applied privacy researchers and engineers for quite some time, but still new in a lot of other companies, but going through and actually physically putting their research into production. So some organizations, that's just looking at putting together a prototype or a proof of concept. Other organizations, they're doing the whole piece, right? They're going right the way through to building that specific piece and putting it into production for their company.
That's super helpful. I really like that breakdown, hearing like privacy software engineer, privacy research engineer. That is definitely a slight change into how we're seeing people structure the titles of the job role. I am curious though, for privacy architects, I'm getting asked more and more if I know of a privacy architect for a role. Are you seeing that in your placements as well, or is it to a lesser degree than some of the privacy engineering roles?
Yeah, that's a great question, Deborah. I think privacy architect is definitely a role I've recruited for a good period of time. It's the number of kind of like requests we get on that side is definitely increasing. I would say what's probably changing more for me is the number of, again, I'm probably going to split this into two sort of sections. I'd have said 2 years ago, pretty much, maybe even 3, pretty much every kind of like requirement or search we were working on for a client that was a privacy architect was, to be honest, pretty much more somebody that was like a differentiate between a TPM and what I'm about to say, a technically minded program manager. So not a TPM, very different to that, but it's essentially a program manager who could speak enough tech to work with architects, work with people who are sitting really deep into that back end to help them plug things together. Definitely still get plenty of those coming through. It's still a really hard job to fill because there aren't many people who can do that. What I'm seeing more of at the moment, and this really fits in well with a lot of the things we'll probably discuss as we move through, is more technical minded people coming into this space. So we're looking at genuine architects who can completely pull apart like data pipelines, the flows within an organization, everything to do with that, and rebuild it themselves. So more in line with what we would consider a traditional like enterprise architect within any other area of tech. So that's what we're seeing more of. And I'm definitely seeing more of a shift towards that. And again, frankly, like every other area, it's a really hard space to find people in, particularly people who can, obviously we can find all of those skills we've just talked about, but then also match up with the tech stack and the requirements or the customer base of that particular organization.
Right. That makes a lot of sense, especially as we start seeing the advent of an explosion of privacy tech. It's like, well, which tech stacks, which new technologies is the company using within their org? So I could understand why that makes it even harder for you and your clients.
That's where things are a little bit different to the engineering side, because I think particularly with companies that are a bit further down the line, they can justify on the engineering side using which languages they want or which like frameworks or packages to design what they need. But when we're getting into like the really nitty gritty, like architectural side, it's like you kind of have to align with what the company's already using. Because you look at like let's say a Fortune like 500, even 1,000 company, like that architecture has been in place for such a long period of time. Like it's just not going to be feasible to like pull in different programs or anything like that to stuff that's like so integral to a company. So yeah, that's where the challenge is a little different to things on the engineering side, where we can make a case for bringing in a new toolkit or something like that. So definitely keeps us on our toes over here.
Yeah, I bet. So the IAPP's Privacy Engineering Section Advisory Board, they recently published an infographic that defines privacy engineering, and it lists job functions that work toward privacy engineering goals. Those job functions are software development, system design, data science, physical architecture, process design, IT infrastructure, and then HCI, so human computer interaction / UX design. Do you think this maps well with how you're seeing companies approach hiring for privacy engineers today? I'm just trying to get a sense of if this is aligned with what you're seeing in the market, or if this is more of a North Star that the IAPP folks who put this together want to get to.
Yeah, so I think a North Star analogy is perfect. I think that to me, that is kind of like the gold standard of what the majority of companies should be sort of aiming to get towards. And I think the majority of companies that we work with and obviously place candidates with are working towards getting certainly close to having each of those kind of defined areas. I think the challenge is that's a journey, right? And everybody is at their own specific point on that. And some people are further along than others, is how I would kind of say. I would say outside of maybe a couple of organizations I'm aware of, would probably aren't at a point where there are too many that have their privacy tech program at such an advanced level, or privacy engineering specifically, where they've broken down into each of these areas. The average, I think, out of companies that we would look at that have a privacy tech function, we're probably looking at an average of maybe 3 people. So naturally, obviously, there's got to be a good amount of kind of consolidation here. And then there obviously are plenty of companies that just have like 1 or maybe 2 people. So obviously these different skill sets have to be like kind of split out between a smaller number of people. I'd say where the majority of companies are at that we kind of work with, who are kind of halfway through this, is that most companies are starting to kind of split into 2 areas. So we're starting to see a lot of the earlier kind of ones that you mentioned there. So software development, system design, and the UX kind of side being grouped into one kind of role. And then a lot of the other pieces kind of coming into another. So data science, architecture, process design, and infrastructure kind of going into another skill set. And there are plenty of good examples of San Francisco companies at the moment who have kind of moved towards having, they don't call it like a front end, but obviously having what I would say is more front end focused, and then having a privacy infrastructure team that are focusing on, like we say, a lot more of that kind of heavy lifting and those back end pieces. So that's where I'd say we're probably at. I definitely agree with the IAPP though. I would love to see in kind of like 3-4 years, the majority of companies out there having really like defined functions across each of these areas, which are also important for a privacy engineering function.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And so I'm going to add the infographic that I'm referencing into the show notes. So if anybody wants to check it out, you can find it there. And then what are just some basic other overall trends you're seeing as companies hire for privacy engineers and technical privacy roles?
Yeah, there's a couple. I'd say the one that kind of stands out the most is probably like the move towards higher technical capabilities. So I think similar to what we touched on with the architecture piece a minute ago, like almost every time we have a client coming back to us, we worked with, let's say 6 or 12 months ago, we're looking for a similar or person that sits within the same team. The jobs are just getting a little bit more technical. So let's say like 12, 18 months ago, we're looking at like basic automation and scripting skills within Python and a good background working with a cloud environment. Now we're looking at people who can come in and write production level codes in Python or potentially like Go. We're even seeing in some instances, we're seeing like Scala kind of coming in a little bit as well, but that's definitely really hard to find. But I'd say that's the same like across the board. So if we go back to the piece we were talking about earlier, where we split those privacy engineering roles into the 3 sections, people in that initial privacy engineering spot, we're looking at being able to advise at a higher level of technical capability to the engineering teams they're working with. We look at the research side and where it might have been just looking at some like anonymization and deletion things. Now we're looking at really kind of detailed applications for differential privacy and obviously areas that are, still really kind of new. So I think the technical kind of like upward curve is definitely the biggest thing I'd say. And I think, again, that's pretty natural in terms of the evolution of what's still a fairly kind of immature space. And I'm not a security recruiter by trade, but I'm sure if you speak to most people, my colleagues, I guess you could say on that side of the fence, I'm sure they'd say that's probably similar to what direction security started going in 6, 7, 8 years ago.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's really helpful. So this is a 2-parter question. I had them separate, but I think they're kind of almost the same question. So what capabilities do companies desperately need or want in candidates that they can't seem to find? Put another way, is there a role that is harder to fill right now than others because of a lack of candidates and skill sets?
Yeah, that's another good one. I think the biggest difficulty we probably have is, and the most like common thing we hear, regardless of the the skill set within privacy tech is the blend of technical and communication skills. So I think certainly my kind of like philosophy on it is privacy technologists, whether it's an engineer, an architect, or a researcher, we sit in a really kind of like unique position. So obviously we have to produce like really high-end technical work that's fit for purpose in some of the best and biggest kind of like tech companies or in other industries out there on the face of the earth. But at the same time, obviously, we're producing this work, producing the products and the code that go out to customers and consumers around the world. Still have to be able to talk to so many different people, which is such a big challenge. I think I can't at the moment really think of any other areas, again, other than possibly security, where you can have some of the brightest and highest paid like technical minds within an industry that still then have to be able to go out and speak to, let's say, like regular software engineers. They need to speak to lawyers, they need to speak to salespeople, and even like obviously business owners of completely different areas. And I think in much bigger organizations, you can potentially have a spot where you can have somebody that doesn't need to do a huge amount of that. But particularly in companies that have teams of, let's say, like 3 to like 15 folks within privacy tech, you can produce the best work possible. But if ultimately you can't go out and then educate people across your organization as to why it's important, it's always going to be a real challenge to get your work out there and actually see it have the end result on the customer. And so I think for me, honestly, that's probably the hardest thing. There's always more digging we can do. There are always more stones we can unturn to find a specific skill set. And that's a challenge. But the biggest one is finding that balance of technical and kind of like softer communication skills as well.
Yeah, no, that makes sense because, it's one of those unicorn roles, right? I guess one of the questions that I have is, why does it have to be one person? Why can't you just hire someone who likes to do the implementation, the work, be in the weeds, who works with someone on the team that is the communicator? I see myself as that communicator kind of role, but it doesn't exist independently from being the engineer when I look at job roles. So any thoughts on that? Like, why are companies determined that it is the exact same role that has both those skill sets of technical and communications capabilities?
Yeah, I think it's more a matter of like circumstance at the moment, Deborah. I think, if we got together every kind of CPO of a company that has a privacy tech function in some shape or another, I'd like to think the majority of them would probably see that role that we're talking about here being on the roadmap. It's more a case at the moment, I think, the biggest case is probably budget, to be perfectly honest. I think particularly off the back of the last like kind of 12 months in the tech industry, everybody is trying to do more with less. And that's always been the case, but that's really kind of pertinent right now. I think as companies continue to shift from the mindset of seeing privacy as a compliance or a legal kind of function into it being a business enabler and a differentiator, that will continue to see teams and budgets grow. And for me, I think that has to be a role that has a really big future within the privacy tech industry. It's just a case, and I guess if we go back to the IAPP infographic that you're going to pop in there, we ultimately, I think most people would like to have at least one person doing each of those things. But the reality is most companies need to, at the moment, have to have one person doing 3 or 4 of those. So it's just a case of, I think, maturing, privacy continuing to become more of an important topic for companies. And as we see that natural kind of evolution, I'd absolutely see that as being a really kind of important skill set for companies to have.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So you mentioned before, we talked a little bit about privacy researchers, and I'm seeing, some companies with large research centers are hiring for privacy researchers, and they typically have PhDs. So a lot of them are coming out, doing their postdocs and coming out of school and going straight into, as you said, becoming applied engineers, basically in the privacy space. So can you speak to what trends you're seeing when it comes to these positions? Are they mostly for data scientists who research privacy enhancing technologies and their deployment, or are there other areas as well? And is it necessary to have a PhD, according to your clients? Because from what I'm seeing, all of them require a PhD.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hello, loyal listeners. The Shifting Privacy Left podcast is seeking sponsors who want to help educate our growing community of privacy engineers. Position your brand in front of privacy engineers, architects, developers, researchers, and privacy tech buyers. Insert a 30 to 60 second ad like this one into every published episode of the podcast. This is dynamic content after all. Feature your new product, an upcoming conference, a sponsored special deal, endless opportunities. Email sponsorship@shiftingprivacyleft.com for more information on our sponsorship package. Okay, let's get back to our engaging privacy conversation.
Yeah, it's definitely a pretty high technical bar to get into that space. I would say at the moment, I can think of a couple of people off the top of my head that don't have a PhD and are in this space. I think the stumbling block for anybody that doesn't have a PhD is that traditionally, bachelor's and master's programs just don't have anywhere near the same level of research within them. So you're fighting a little bit of kind of an upward battle there in the sense that you've got people with a PhD have the best part of 4, 5, or sometimes 6 years worth of research experience that they can apply straight into what it is they're doing. I think we'll probably continue to see that being the dominance. Like, I can't imagine that we'll see much of a shift, certainly in the short term, where we'll see folks without that really kind of like proven research background making the jump. There are definitely alternatives to it. I think MITRE, obviously affiliated with the government, is a great example. I have seen people go and work with a technical master's, obviously, with MITRE, who've done a lot of research there and have then got to a point of going into an applied research role with a tech company. So it's absolutely possible, but it's definitely the less trodden path at the moment. In terms of, I think your other point was around people coming from like that sort of data science background, kind of the same thing. Like, we predominantly see people coming from a data science or a more kind of pure computer science background into that space, largely because obviously those are the programs that have the most crossover with privacy enhancing technologies. So again, probably about 65% of the people that I've worked with in that space have had a part of their thesis or part of their research has been focused on some form of either privacy enhancing technology or an adjacent space. But there are plenty of people out there who obviously have focused on the fundamentals and are then able to make the jump across and apply their research background, their technical knowledge and skill set to the privacy space. I'd say most often it's people who've always had that kind of, or had some kind of interest in privacy, whether they've been impacted by a breach at a company or a family member or a friend has had something like that, or could be something completely different. But yeah, that's, I'd say, typically what we see at the moment.
Interesting. Thank you so much. That's really insightful. For my audience there might be people out there who are already technical and want to grow into the privacy space and maybe become a privacy engineer or researcher or architect, what advice would you give them?
So firstly, great news. I'm very confident we're going to see this transition become easier and easier to make. I guess on one hand, you can say fairly simple sort of economics and supply versus demand. Like, we're certainly, other than a couple of big layoffs we talked about earlier, we're not seeing any companies decreasing the number of people they have in their privacy function. The vast majority are obviously increasing it. And there is a limited supply of people coming in who've rolled off one of the master's programs. I've also happy to kind of add to that. I've had a number of conversations with clients in the last 2-3 months where they're already aware of that and they're already quite keen to start exploring hiring people with really, really strong technical backgrounds who have some skills that are adjacent to privacy, some kind of reason or some understanding of that space. So just a baseline knowledge rather than coming as sort of the ready-made candidate who's done exactly the same role elsewhere. So probably answer your question, Deborah, in terms of being able to, I guess, upskill in your own time and get yourself ready for that jump. There's a few different avenues that I've seen work really well and have helped kind of candidates with in the past. So the first one, and I think I would suggest this for everybody who's looking to make this jump, is the kind of formal qualifications. So the CIPT course that the IAPP rolled out, I think probably about 3 years ago now, it's a really great starting point. Obviously, it's going to teach you the fundamentals of the privacy world, how to apply some of your technical background to it. And it's just I'm honest, if nothing else, it's also going to put something on paper that shows you're really interested in the space and committed to kind of making that jump. Second piece, like less formal, but more kind of, I guess, achievable to anybody in their like day-to-day kind of role is getting more privacy exposure. So that can be like seeking out like privacy related projects or changes in your current role. Happily tell you, I can't think of anybody I know certainly high up in the privacy tech world that wouldn't be happy to have an extra pair of technical hands on a specific project. So trying to find out where those are, get them at the top of your resume and make sure they're really clear when you're speaking to people, you know, when you're applying for that next role, what it is that you've done. The other piece, I guess I'd say on that, and more for the kind of engineers, but specifically is, again, just being involved in the privacy space. So if you've got a GitHub, start playing around with writing privacy code or potentially even like privacy preserving products of some degree. Now, that can sound quite daunting to somebody that's never done it before, but I don't think it needs to be. Like, you don't need to go in and build the finished product right away. Just being able to display to somebody and pop your GitHub link on your resume that shows that you're playing around, you're interested in that space, and you're already putting your own time into developing your skill set there is going to set you above so many people out there, certainly from my perspective. And again, I firsthand have seen that work really effectively over the last couple of years. The last thing is for a little bit kind of like further down the line, but having a really clear why. So we can even take like a step back from this. I mean, any candidate that goes into interview for any job should have, in my opinion, a really clear why they want that job and why they would be good at it. If you can answer that question or give a hiring manager, interviewer, whoever it is, like a really clear and confident answer, to me, that's always going to have them leaving the interview with a really good feeling. Even if it's not the right fit, they're still going to leave with a really positive impression of you. And for me, really specifically, if you're looking to make a jump into a slightly different industry, having a really clear why that you can articulate appropriately and share with that person, it's always going to put you in a really great spot. To me, it doesn't matter too much what that why is. As long as it's clearly like something that's important to you, then for me, that's always going to put you in a really good spot and hopefully give you a really good chance of making that jump.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It also makes me think of networking, right? Going to events where there's privacy engineering folks there and building those relationships so that even if there's not a position for you right now, if you make a good connection, like you were saying in an interview, but here in a networking capacity, they might think of you for another role in the future, whether on their team or if they move to another company and have a new hiring mandate. So you leverage your network, not when you don't go build a network because you want a job right now. You build a network so that you have a network to go to when you are seeking that job in the future. And so that forethought, I think, has really done well for me in my career, just generally. So I would extend that suggestion to anyone who's listening and seeking any job role, right? Like go to where people are who are hiring managers. And so you could learn from them and build relationships.
100%. Yeah, I completely agree, Deborah. And I think particularly, obviously, the two biggest ones, obviously the two that the IAPP run within the US, right? So like, if you're based in the Northeast, get yourself across to the conference in DC at the start of April next year. If you can get down to San Diego for the PSR conference that I think, is that in October? I want to say it's the start of October.
I think so.
Yeah.
It's October.
If you can get yourself down to those events, then that's brilliant. You don't often even need a pass, like just being able to be around there, send a few messages to people on LinkedIn who've posted about going and try and grab a coffee or a drink with them is a great thing to do. And I've definitely seen people leverage those conferences into helping them get jobs in the future. So yeah, that's a great bit of advice. Yeah.
And then there's all of these privacy engineering conferences popping up around the globe as well. Some of them connected to research and universities, others that are a little more show and tell and cross-functional, like the Pepper conference, the Privacy Engineering Practice and Respect conference. It's a Usenix conference I believe it's in September in the Bay Area. That's a really good one too. There's so much out there. Just don't sit behind your computer and just apply for jobs all day. Instead, get out there and go where practitioners are that you can meet. So here is a question that I'm definitely excited to hear you talk about. It's about salary ranges, because anyone who's paying attention can see that there's a very wide range of salary ranges for these different privacy roles, right? Like privacy engineer, code review, privacy software engineer, privacy research engineer, like you mentioned before, and privacy architect. What are the typical pay ranges across these different technical privacy roles? And what companies are looking at the lower range, what at the higher range, and what are like the pros and cons that applicants should be thinking about?
Yeah, I'm definitely going to get a few messages about this down the line, aren't I? Somebody who's ended up like way more than I said they could get, and I'm always happy to have people challenge me on that. So yeah, no worries. Yeah, as you put it, it's such a wide range. Like it's a really tough one to like kind of nail down, but I'll definitely do my best. I think the first thing I'd say, particularly anybody at like an earlier kind of stage in their career, is really sit down and think about what the non-negotiables are for you. And for me, like whenever somebody says like kind of total package in inverted commas, for me, I think obviously, listen, like cash is always important, particularly if you live in a high cost area, but start to think more about things like scope for growth. Like where have people gone when they've joined this team at the same stage that I'm at? Where have they moved to after? Is this really kind of taking me in the right direction? So yeah, I'd always say get a really good list of those things there. Make sure you're really clear on what's important to you before you start to jump into this, because as you put it there, Deborah, there is a range for all of these roles, but it typically will be different types of companies and different, like a different level of requirement they're asking from you at the different ends of it. What I would typically say, and again, this is a bit of a generalization, is that if you're looking at more enterprise type firms, so companies that have been around for a little bit longer, they're a bit bigger, and not necessarily an Amazon or a Facebook or a Google or a Reddit, somebody like that, you're probably going to be looking towards the kind of like first half of the ranges I'm going to give you here. If you're looking at like more advanced companies, or let's say like an OpenAI, somebody who's really on the cutting edge, then typically you're going to be looking at the higher end. But just make sure you balance up what they're asking from you in terms of input to get what you're getting out. So as a real broad brushstroke, I'd say as like that first privacy engineer we discussed, probably looking at like kind of 130 to 210 on the base side at the top end, and around kind of like 170 to 300 total. Privacy software engineer, probably like 175 to around 300 base, and around 250 to kind of 450 total. Research, this is where it gets like really broad. So anything from like kind of 175 through to like mid threes on the base, and then kind of like 3 to potentially like 650 in terms of total. I'd say the top end of that is going to be tough if you're just rolling off a PhD. That's probably somebody that has been through a couple of roles there. On the architecture side, slightly different, probably looking at kind of like 170 to kind of like 275 base, and around 250 to 400, maybe 450 at the top end in terms of total comp. So yeah, really broad ranges. And listen, if anybody wants kind of a bit more detail on that, the IAPP guides are pretty good, but I'm also happy if people want to reach out. I'm always happy to kind of have a chat and see if I can steer them in the right direction on those.
Yeah, no, that's really insightful. I am curious though, because we are talking about like just broadly a privacy engineer, but what about like a manager role, right? Like let's say a privacy engineering manager versus a independent contributor kind of role?
Yeah, that's a great question, Deborah. So in terms of that, I would say your best bet on that one, because this is where it does get similar to the research, where it gets really broad. I'd say the best bet for anybody who wants to understand that for a company they're looking at is I would probably go and use like a blind or levels.fyi. Have a look at the software engineering manager bandings for the companies that you're looking at. That will give you a really accurate readout, because again, those bandings become so broad and so wild. I don't know if it's necessarily going to be great for me to put a number on that right now.
Okay. Yeah, it could be high. Like it could be really high, which is good. I just want the listeners to know the career pathing if they choose to go a privacy engineering route and want to go up the chain, that right now it could be pretty lucrative. But it also could be a lot more work and a different kind of environment than they necessarily want to work in. So there's always pros and cons. Could you describe what the Blind app is for those who aren't aware?
Sure. Yeah. So Blind and Levels are the two that I use kind of like most regularly. They're just like web apps that you can go on, pick out a particular organization, and then it will give you a readout of basically it's crowdsourced information and data, right? So data on what people get paid at those specific levels, which particularly in tech, when it's not as relevant for like a banking community, for example, because those bandings are so well established and have been there for so long. But you think like a Microsoft, for example, have like 50 different levels within the organization. So it's really good at just breaking down what band you can expect from a base salary, a bonus if there is one, and from an equity perspective. So yeah, super helpful. It's also every company structures their packages slightly differently. Some companies obviously way more slanted towards the stock element, some companies more towards like base and bonus. So it's for me a really helpful way just to try and understand how a package is structured, what you can expect, and what sort of banding you should be within if you're applying at that particular organization.
Excellent. I really appreciate that. I think that's going to be really helpful. And I'll put a link to the Blind app in the show notes as well. So are your clients seeking any true entry-level positions for technical privacy roles, or are they kind of saying it's an entry-level role, but it really requires like a ton of prerequisite experience?
So we don't typically get engaged too often on entry level positions. A lot of companies will try and do that themselves wherever they can, because obviously the outlay on employing a search firm like us it's not cheap, and so they'll try and find graduates where they can themselves. We do occasionally, maybe like a couple a year. I would say certainly from what I see, and again, I'm very happy to be kind of challenged on this by people. We don't have the same problem that you have in security, where companies look for entry-level candidates, or they say they're looking for entry-level and then are looking for like 3 or 4 years of experience or X, Y, or Z qualifications that people normally get down the line. So a lot of the time when I see, again, entry-level roles out there, I think they're banded at around the right type of level. The trouble is always going to be that, because most companies will try and do that directly. If you go and click on apply on LinkedIn, you could get lucky. You can get in front of the right person at the right time. But so often there are so many people that it's a really high chance you just get lost amongst people who are just unqualified. So I think, maybe one bit of advice, if you don't mind picking it up, Deborah, I'd say for anybody who is rolling off, one of the master's programs or looking for that entry-level role within privacy tech, go and have a look on LinkedIn, see if you can find the talent acquisition people who focus on privacy. Try to build a relationship with them. Even if those companies aren't hiring right now, those people are always going to be invaluable kind of in your career and helping you get through the door. And also make sure you're not one of 300 or 400 resumes for a position. You're somebody that's actually getting pushed forward. I'd say do the same with agency recruiters as well. There aren't loads of us in the privacy world, and we're less likely to be able to help you right now. But any decent kind of like agency recruiter in the privacy space will try and build that relationship with you for 3, 4, 5 years, and should be in a good spot to help you at some point during that period of time, if not a couple of times.
That's great advice. Thanks for that. What's the best way for privacy technologists to stay up to date on hiring trends? What resources do you use or do you suggest they tune into?
I'm actually going to defer back to your bit of advice from a few minutes ago, Deborah. I think the best way is always going to be FaceTime with people in the industry. So if you can get yourself to the conferences, I know you mentioned a couple that are slightly newer there and focused on privacy tech, all the larger ones. Getting to those conferences, getting along to the whether it's the happy hours or the dinners, and just trying to get as much FaceTime with people as you can, for me is always going to be the best way to kind of stay up to date on that. I'd also say, especially if you haven't done much of that before, go in with like 2 or 3 kind of like questions and that you've jotted down on a piece of paper or on your phone that you can just drop into conversation to try and understand a bit more. Obviously, try not to sound too robotic with the delivery, which I've definitely done a few times, but just trying to ask people, what kind of initiatives they're working on, what are the big kind of like focuses from a privacy engineering perspective, is always a great way to just sort of absorb and learn as much about what other people are doing. The other thing I'd say is like newsletters. Like most of the conferences we've mentioned, the companies that run them have newsletters, and they're always one of my biggest resources. So yeah, getting signed up to those, reading them when you're having your coffee in the morning is a great way to do it, and a great way just to stay up to date with like general things that are kind of happening. So yeah, to be honest, those are probably the 2 biggest ones that I use, and just just kind of chatting to people as much as I can, which I'm sure you can tell by now I love to do.
Same. Awesome. Well, we're nearing the close. I just want to make sure that people can reach out to you if they have questions or if they are seeking, either to hire you to help place people in their companies for privacy technology roles, or if they are looking for jobs. What's the best way to contact you?
Yeah, sure. So always happy for anybody to reach out. Yeah, always happy to have a conversation, help wherever I can. Best way is always through LinkedIn. So just pop me a note on LinkedIn and we'll be able to find some time to catch up.
Awesome. Any last pearls of wisdom you want to leave the audience with today before we close?
I don't think so, Deborah, but honestly, thank you so much for having me. It's been great to talk a little bit about these things, and I really hope it's helpful for people out there.
Yeah, likewise. I definitely want feedback from the audience if you're finding this helpful. So feel free to reach out and, let us know, because we'd like to bring more content like this in the future as well. George, thank you so much for joining us today on Shifting Privacy Left to discuss hiring trends for privacy engineers and other technical privacy roles. I definitely hope to have you back in the future to update us on trends.
Thanks, Deborah. Yeah, anytime. It's been an absolute pleasure. We'd love to come back.
Excellent. Until next Tuesday, everyone, when we'll be back with engaging content and another great guest. Thanks for joining us this week on Shifting Privacy Left. Make sure to visit our website, shiftingprivacyleft.com, where you can subscribe to updates so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found this episode valuable, go ahead and share it with a friend. And if you're an engineer who cares passionately about privacy, check out Privado, the developer-friendly privacy platform and sponsor of this show. To learn more, go to privado.ai. Be sure to tune in next Tuesday for a new episode. Bye for now.